Hello, Salamander family. Welcome back to the Region Beacon, the podcast where we fight for the literal and figurative salamanders. My name is Reed Brown, and this is episode 4, Reflections. Hi, everybody. I hope you all had great holidays. I hope your life has been filled with delicious meals, cozy spaces, quality time with family, time shared with the people you love and the people who love you. I hope you feel vibrant, both now in the present moment, and ever more so into the new year. I hope you feel clarity of mind and a sense of purpose. I hope that physical movement comes easily to you, and that your digestion nurtures you, and that you are not in pain. When and where you are not doing well, I hope you find strength, rest, healing, and vigor anew. I hope that this can be a good year for you personally and for everyone, for everything. I hope that we can rise, bring our best selves to the year, and make it as good of one as it can be. Happy holidays, Happy New Year. In this episode, I want to focus on reflection, specifically 3 sets of reflections. In the first section, I will offer the broad arc of my personal regenerative journey, from childhood until when I moved away from Ames and my community garden food forest, circa 2022. I will fill in the last couple of years and my current efforts in another episode. In part 2, I want to reflect on the series so far, chiefly episodes 2 and 3, in a section called Feats of Catharsis, Failures of Persuasion. It's been several weeks since I've released the episodes, and I've heard heartfelt feedback from many of you, from many different angles. I've also had more time to digest my own arguments and the emotions present in the segments. There's a lot to dig into, and as I am one to never pass on an overwrought metaphor, we'll dive deeper into the thoughts and arguments through the lens of a balanced compost. In part 3, I reflect on the act of questioning norms and conventional wisdom itself, and share an anecdote from the world of global regenerative agriculture that serves as an important case study in this area. But first, my regenerative journey, part 1. We enter the world as babies. We have some reflexes and instincts on how to suckle, how to sneeze, cry, how to fart, pee, and make big booty diaper blowouts. We are born with brains loosely encased in soft skulls, with neuronal structures primed to learn, but not really knowing anything. Not knowing ourselves from our parents, day from night, how to move our bodies in a coordinated way, certainly not how to maximize an order at Chipotle or effectively navigate a Costco trip on a Sunday afternoon. We enter the world really not knowing anything beyond being warm and dry feels good, being held feels nice, ceiling fans are fascinating, and milk is delicious. And then, over time, we learn everything else. I had a visceral sensation of just how much information informs a worldview a few months before my new baby daughter and sponsor of this show, Hazel, was born. I stared in my mind at the vast library's worth of knowledge that one needs to absorb to become a fully fledged, vibrant person. It was like looking out over a vast expanse of terrain before you, knowing you will only ever get halfway, that the journey and direction are the most important, the ending always an incomplete story. It was exciting to think about my role in helping her learn all the wonders of the world, and also incredibly daunting. As a kid, I remember feeling intimidated by the knowledge of adults. How can a person have so many stories? How can someone know so many things, have accomplished so much? The gulf between where I was and where they were seemed insurmountable. Currently, I'm right around 32 and a half years old, an adult by any metric. And though I remain curious about the world, I have developed some level of insight and perspective of my own. We build knowledge, day by day, chasing joy while layering on our new experiences on top of what we have already learned. We scaffold new facts onto the existing foundations of our knowledge. With each insight gleaned, we are better able to glean more insights, building upon our newfound wisdom and developing our view of the world. I started this series with a goal, to fight for the salamanders, to make more life than death, using the tools of regenerative culture and regenerative agriculture. Here are the broad strokes of how I got to be here. Starting at the beginning, or I suppose as close to the beginning as to not be crude, I was born a lucky child to loving parents, with brothers, and dear friends from an early age. I grew up in the 90s and the 2000s in the heart of central Iowa suburbia, land of lawns, sidewalks, parks, and strip malls. I grew up near a bike trail, but in a land dominated by cars. I was given physical and emotional space to explore, taught to bike at an early age, taught to whittle sticks with pocket knives, and how to bandage myself when I inevitably cut myself. I was always allowed to play in the nearby forest with my friends and bring back minnows to feed our pet snapping turtle and crayfish. My family went camping, hiked in the mountains, crawled through caves, swam in the ocean. We traveled widely inside of the United States and a little bit outside of it. So I was exposed to many different people and places. The garden was planted every year, mostly by my dad, fertilized with my mom's enthusiasm. My mom planted the idea of fresh veggies and zinnia flowers, and my dad would go and dutifully prep the garden beds and plant the seeds and transplants. As a little boy, I got to walk around the garden with my parents, eating the snap peas that I called pea candies, and picking the flowers. I got to tear off and squeeze mint leaves in my fingers, luxuriating in their smell. I got to feel the fuzzy leaves of the naturalized biennial black-eyed Susan flowers and see the caterpillars eating the dill. The garden was behind the house, along the edge of the sidewalk going up to the public park. The garden had a fence along the walkway, a rotting ranch-style lattice that red and black raspberries could easily arch over in their rampant, spiky profusion, and eventually, by midsummer, hiding the fence entirely. It was well known in the neighborhood that the berries on the outside of the fence were fair game. All the berries on the inside of the fence were for our family. People were generally respectful of that, and thinking back, it was an early lesson in sharing surplus and living in community. Every year, my mom and us kids would go help weed the beds once or twice in the spring, and largely let the weeds take over by high summer. Every year, my dad would make some valiant attempts at getting things back under control in the heat of summer and swearing that it was the last year he was ever doing this. Then every year, after a long winter inside, came spring, and my mom's enthusiasm would bloom again, and the cycle would continue. Eventually, my dad actually did have enough, and he followed through with his threat of not wanting to do the garden anymore. But by that time, I was entering high school, and had decided that I would become the new family gardener. I followed in the footsteps of my parents, using the same basic layout, preparing the soil with a spade and a hoe as I'd been taught, but I also brought my own flair of feral forest whimsy. I collected some long branches from the nearby woods and lashed them together using twine and my rope skills from Boy Scouts and time building forts. I wove spider web-like structures for my beans to grow up, part practical and part artistic expression. That year, I did a whole host of experiments, including taking the mixed soup beans from our kitchen and sprouting each kind. It was remarkable to see the similarities in form, the same basic dicotyledon sprout design, but huge differences in the size and leaf color between the lentils, peas, kidney beans, and large lima beans. It would be revisionist history to not point out that I also completely failed at weeding the garden. It produced a lot and was beautiful in my eyes, but by the end of the season, there were enough buttonweeds and grasses sticking out that it was pretty unkempt. One day, my friends Nick, Kane, David, and I actually had a weed fight over the fence, lobbing buttonweed stems and zucchinis and semi-rotten tomatoes back and forth at each other. The good kind of boys will be boys fun. At the same time as I was managing our garden, I began mowing a few of my neighbors' yards. I learned the art of the bi-directional crosshatch, of string trimming and edging. I thought then, and definitely think now, that grass is overrated, but I also think $20 is $20, especially back in the 2000s, and even more so when exchanged between you, me, and the fence post. Mowing yards not only taught me the technical aspects of yard care and how to take pride in my work, but also about plants and horticulture more broadly. Many of the yards I tended brought me into contact with perennial fruits and nut trees. In one yard, there was an apple tree that I watched each year develop from bud to flower to fruit over the growing season. In another yard I mowed, there was a bountiful grove of walnut trees near the bottom of a fertile valley with plenty of water and deep black soil. Every year, they would litter the yard with hundreds of nuts. And in yet another yard, I encountered one of my first plum tree friends, an heirloom variety full of purple oval fruits that I would feast on in the fall, and one year even sprouted a few for fun. I would be remiss if I didn't also mention my friend Kane's house. His parents, being very well-traveled people, built something of a Mediterranean grotto in the backyard of their suburban lot, complete with a large fountain and extensive trellis system on which they grew several varieties of prolific table grapes. We spent time out there on occasions innumerable, but I will always remember a simple summer meal his mom prepared for us one day with zucchinis, onions, peppers, roasted in a wire vegetable basket on a grill, and served over French bread with goat cheese and balsamic vinaigrette. The food was delicious. Eating the feast under the dappled shade of the pergola with my extended family was a delight. A year or two after I took over managing the family garden coincided with me taking a plant science course in high school. It was an interesting course because half of the students were high-achieving plant nerds like myself, and the other half were students at high academic risk, students that needed to take an easy biology credit to graduate. So it was an incredibly relaxing course for me to take, no homework. Perhaps relatedly, it was also a course in which I learned an enormous amount. We did little experiments on gravitropism, where we watched a pea sprout in a petri dish, rotating it each day to see how the root readjusted to grow in alignment with gravity. We learned about dedifferentiation, the ability of differentiated plant cells, think leaves, stems, roots, to change their expressed genetic machinery to divide into new kinds of cells. It's the ability of plants that allows you to take a cutting and then have them grow roots from previously stem tissue. If humans could do it, it would be like taking a chunk of pinky and having it grow into a liver. Plants are amazing. At that time, the plant science teacher was also working on establishing a section of prairie in the high school grounds. He'd been given explicit assurances that it would never be developed. Obviously, it was developed a few years later, so it goes. But when I was in the class, we worked on that patch of prairie, adding native seeds and transplants. We learned that certain seeds had germination requirements, and did experiments with scarification and cold stratification to see if we could improve the germination rates. The plant science teacher was also my homeroom teacher, my good fortune, and it gave me access to the only greenhouse in the building. On the days we had homeroom, he would go over whatever announcement there was for the day, and then while my home roommates would watch a show like The Office, I would have 20 minutes to go out and play in the greenhouse. This enabled me to sprout veggies for the first time, growing my first flats of heirloom tomato seedlings, and they grew amazingly. It turns out if you have good seeds, potting mix, water, and a climate-controlled greenhouse, growing things is pretty easy. Although I was an active gardener and relatively outdoorsy suburban boy, I didn't intend on doing anything with gardening or biology professionally. To be honest, I didn't really have any idea what I wanted to do in life. I'd been involved with drama and choir and soccer, cross country, mock trial, Model UN, speech, and especially debate. I sort of assumed that I would become a lawyer eventually. When I got to college, I enrolled as a linguistics and international studies double major with a minor in Spanish to sprinkle on a little extra liberal arts flavor. I lived in the honors dorm the first year on campus, living in community with all of the beautiful nerds, hosting completely sober raves in the basement of the dorm and playing intramural Quidditch. I also joined the University Garden Club. It was interesting to see the larger scale production and to meet like-minded people. We got together to plant out the garden and hosted veggie-centered potlucks. I vividly recall a party where multiple people were describing their own personal favorite homemade veganese recipes. It was a conversation that felt like home. I don't remember exactly when and from whom I first heard of the concept of permaculture, but I believe it was from one of the gardeners in the club. For the unfamiliar, permaculture is a decentralized countercultural movement that originated in 1978 in Australia and seeks to develop a permanent agriculture and permanent culture. Learning about permaculture is a deep rabbit hole. I like to describe it as agroecology mixed with yoga. At least that gives a sense of the vibe. It's a movement full of knowledge and power, largely built upon indigenous wisdom and traditions from across the globe and applying them to modern Western agricultural systems. Like any movement, it has at times also tended towards the insular, pedantry, elitism, and closed-mindedness, though it feels from my perspective like the peak of that crested in the 2010s. It is an interesting testament to the power of permaculture and related movements that many of the heterodox views proposed actually have become quite mainstream. For example, the power of using beneficial insects to both pollinate crops, but to also protect crops against insect predators, to reduce our reliance on external inputs like synthetic fertilizers and herbicides in favor of composts and mulch, good practices. There's also a human component that we should embrace the human role in our environments and communities, using appropriate technology, but not relying entirely on extractive industrial systems to meet all of our basic needs. These ideas and more have become much more mainstream along with the rise of sustainability, organic agriculture, and ethical business movements. but all of them owe at least some of their popularization to permaculture. In today's day and age, we live both in the corporal realm and the virtual. My journey into gardening was no different. On YouTube and in podcasts, I began to delve deep into the world of permaculture. And at that time, there were still many lectures with the entertaining Aussie father permaculture Bill Mollison in the popular algorithmic recommendations. This brought me into contact with the work of Jeff Lawton and Rosemary Morrow, David Holmgren, as well as later generation permaculturalists like Andrew Millison. As I began to become immersed in the world of permaculture, I went back to some of the seminal works that inspired the founders, specifically Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, Masanobu Fukuoka's One Straw Revolution, P.A. Yeoman's Water for Every Farm. I also delved into other related but distinct movements, into survivalism and primitive skills, homesteading, rewilding, syntropic agroforestry, natural building, ecological restoration, and regenerative agriculture. This was also during the height of TED Talks, and at some point I stumbled across Alan Savory's seminal talk on rotational grazing and his holistic management movement. As my interest became more focused on agriculture, I began to absorb more home gardening and market gardening content with creators like Richard Perkins, Sean and Sasha Dombrowski of Edible Acres, Curtis Stone, Jesse Thorne, Diego Footer, Justin Rhodes, Angela Baker, Elliot Coleman, Charles Dowding, Hugh Richards, James Prigioni, Kristen Dirksen, Paul Wheaton, Morgan Gold, Pete Canaris, Akiva Silver, Ben Falk, Bruce Darrell, and Summer Rain. I checked out talks with experts like Leah Penniman, Dr. Elaine Ingram, Neil Spackman, Mark Shepard, Vinata Shiva. I have watched and continue to watch a lot of regenerative YouTube. It's played an important part in developing my knowledge and worldview. I've seen the results of lifetimes of people's projects from around the world, learned from their successes and their failures, from viewpoints different than my own. As a student, I also had access to Web of Science, basically peer-reviewed Google that you unfortunately do need academic credentials to access easily, but I had access. And while I was doing research in a computational biochemistry lab, I found one of the few ways to take a little break when I had a simulation running or I was just tired was to do a literature review, but I would be a little sneaky and do a literature review on the subjects that I was actually interested in as opposed to computational biochemistry. These were topics like agroecology and silvopasture, sociology, public health, urban beekeeping, academic publications on permaculture, soil structure. Whatever query struck my fancy in the moment, I looked up. I specifically remember a treatise on the ecosystem services provided by hedgerow systems around the world, and have forever since been on Team Hedgerow. At the same time as my independent study, I was formally learning about the domains of physics and chemistry, organic chemistry, biochemistry, biology, microbiology, cell biology, virology, zoonotics, endocrinology, anatomy, physiology, and pathology. All of that is to say that my worldview of the natural world is underpinned and influenced by scientific understanding, especially weighted towards the biomedical science and biochemistry. However much you can learn by classes or media, ultimately, there is no complete substitute for hands-on learning. A year or two after I graduated from undergrad and moved to Ames for a master's program, I joined up with a couple of my friends and we signed up for some community garden plots. On the day registration opened, we showed up to City Hall and were able to snag 4 10x40 plots. Fortuitously, all of these plots were in sequence, so we could combine them into one 40x40 square foot garden. As fate would have it, the year I joined was the year the city removed their mandatory annual tilling requirement, after a kerfuffle the previous year with a gardener that had planted garlic and then the garlic had been tilled under. This decision enabled me to take the garden in a direction that I'm sure the city did not foresee, but that was vibrant. In the first year of the garden, my friends and I went about converting the relatively blank slate of overgrown weeds into a grid of 6x6 square foot garden beds with 3 L-shaped beds along the perimeter. I gardened this space for many years, and the design evolved over time. Initially, I put one plum tree in the corner of the garden, but largely focused on annual crops. The first year, I grew massive sunflowers and zucchinis in profusion, transplanted native prairie and woodland flowers. I brought glacial erratic fieldstones and logs to give the bed's edges and bugs a home to live under. The first year, I also tried to grow a lot of other crops like peas, lettuce, beets, carrots, but lost a lot of the annual crops to rabbit pressure. Every garden is in a unique space with a certain exposure to wind, a certain level of shade from nearby trees and objects, and a unique level of wildlife. The Ames Community Gardens are situated along a scrub floodplain forest that's ideal for rabbits. Some deer, raccoons, squirrels, weasels, foxes, but so many rabbits. I would spend the next several seasons strengthening and re-strengthening the fence using new and used materials. I incrementally dug chicken wire a foot into the ground and put it higher up the fence, replacing plastic with metal, closing any gaps under the gate. I used snow in the winter to search for any openings that the bunnies were sneaking through and to track them back to their entry holes. The effort to exclude rabbits from the garden was one of the hallmark challenges of my time in the community garden, and I didn't have it completely bunny-proofed until about the third year of gardening. Over time, I put in more berry crops like strawberries and honeyberries, as well as herbaceous perennial crops like asparagus, rhubarb, horseradish. I began to add in more experimental crops like eastern and plains prickly pear, an African lettuce tree called moringa that humorously bewildered one of my fellow gardener friends from Ghana when she saw it. And over time, I began to add even more keystone elements to most of the square beds, in this case, fruit trees. By the time I left Ames, I was growing 5 apple trees, 3 plum trees, 2 pear trees, 2 peach trees, a multi-grafted cherry tree, 2 apricot trees, and more in the garden. I also grafted on various varieties to each of the trees to ensure that pollination would be stable in the future if their partners were lost. To keep the garden feeling open, in the middle of the garden I left an area free of trees and that I thought of as a meadow. That's where I grew my annual crops. I was fully involved in developing and tending to the garden for 6 seasons before I moved away, and then I tended to it at distance for a couple of years. Eventually, my friends Nick and Beth took it over when they moved to Ames. I actually just gave a mini lightning talk at the PFI, Practical Farmers of Iowa conference last weekend that described my experience with the Ames Community Garden Food Forest, as well as my experience moving around the state, playing with aquaculture, and sprouting trees and tending to seedlings. I've added that video to YouTube if you're interested in checking it out. The garden was such a big, informative space for me that I'm also working on fleshing out that talk more fully. I have a ton of photos and videos to bring in the color and texture of the story. So I'll post a full extended audiovisual presentation of the garden soon. This is where I'll leave my personal garden-focused regenerative reflections for this episode. In the future, I will describe the work I did around the state when I left Ames, what I'm currently working on, and my farm goals for the future. And now, a word from our sponsors. Today's sponsor is brought to you by Longing for Spring. Are you longing for spring? I am. I'm longing for spring so bad that I've already started planting pepper seedlings for fun, even though it is way too early. I can't wait for spring to get out in the garden and start growing some food. Doesn't mean I actually want it to be warm outside like it has been, just longing for when it is seasonally appropriate in a couple of months. Thank you, spring. I'm longing to see you. Part 2. Composting, a feat of catharsis and a failure of persuasion. One big trick in gardening is to foster life in the soil. The easiest and fastest way to do this is to decompact it and add good compost. We'll get into the basics of the universe and origins of life in the next episode, but suffice to say in this episode that the universe, on the atomic scale, is made of atoms. The universe is fractal, so you can go deeper to the subatomic scale. But as a chemist, I like to half-joke that anything below the scale of protons, neutrons, electrons is an interesting academic distraction. Atoms are where it's at. The different kinds of atoms are divided into elements, with each element differing from the other elements in the number of protons that make it up. Most elements also come in a few fun flavors called isotopes that have the same number of protons but additional neutrons. You probably have an image of the periodic table where all of the elements are arranged in neat columns and rows by their atomic numbers. Like all of the best scientific figures, the periodic table contains a ton of information if you know how to decode it. For today, it is enough to point out that life is made mostly of the elements carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen. There's contributions from many other elements like sodium, chlorine, potassium, phosphorus, sulfur, trace contributions from elements like iron, selenium, molybdenum, zinc, and more. The most important elements to think of for compost are carbon and nitrogen. Hydrogen comes along with the carbon, and oxygen comes from the air. Woody matter is very high in carbon and very low in nitrogen. It has a high C to N ratio, as we like to say. Animal poop, pee, and the classic combo cloacal excrement of birds and reptiles all have a high nitrogen content. That's actually one of the main reasons we have kidneys, to take excess nitrogen out of the blood in the form of urea. Nitrogen is so important agronomically that we used to travel the high seas to go and pick up bird and bat poop from remote islands and bring the stinky gold back home. Now, we use 1.4% of the total CO2 emissions on Earth just for fixing nitrogen from the air using a technique called the Haber-Bosch process. Life is amazing and unbelievably diverse. It is a truism in biology that we will refer back to often that universal axioms in biology almost always fail. Biology is messy. Blanket rules are almost never true in all cases. But in an exception to the rule, in all cases that we know of on Earth, life is built from high energy carbon. We are carbon-based life forms. Carbon structurally makes up our cells. The oxidation of carbon also drives the complex chemical stew within us. This is high chemical energy, aka reduced carbon. It also drives the energy for compost, and drives your car and gasoline. Like a fire or your forehead, if you feel an active compost pile, it's hot. It can get so hot that some people make large piles of compost specifically to heat water for showers or to heat covered greenhouses over the winter to keep plants warm. For some composts, called thermophilic composting, this heat is used to kill off any potential harmful bacteria, like certain strains of E. coli. Carbon-rich materials have a lot of energy, but they don't have a lot of nutrient, in the same way that rice, bread, pasta have a lot of energy that can help you run a race, but won't help you build muscles. That is because proteins are made of individual amino acids, and the amine group of amino acids contains nitrogen atoms. Nitrogen builds protein. It also builds nucleic acids, your DNA and RNA, and a whole host of other metabolites. Carbon is the main fuel source, and nitrogen is the main nutrition source in your compost. For any composts, you want to have balance of the carbon and nitrogen. Too little nitrogen, and the pile will decompose very slowly and not provide a lot of nutrition for your plants. For garden annuals especially, this is not the kind of compost you're going for. But if you add too much nitrogen, the pile can run too hot and kill off the beneficial decomposing organisms. It's also important to note that the compost needs oxygen. It needs to breathe just like you do, just like a candle does or a campfire. When compost piles don't get enough oxygen, if they're too compacted, too wet, they go anaerobic and become rank, fetid, and release putrid, rotting compounds like ammonia and hydrogen sulfide. All of that is to say that you need to find the right balance to make good compost. Not too much heat and not too little oxygen. So, how does it relate to the podcast? Well, I've been reflecting on the podcast so far, how my words have sat with me, what I've heard back from you, my friends, family, strangers. We are 3, now 4 episodes in, and I'd say that we've gone places, conceptually and emotionally. The podcast is one of my amateur attempts at public intellectualism. Now, you can think that I'm perceptive and insightful, or an arrogant fool. Perhaps, as Greg Armbruster commented on YouTube, a wacko. But I'm engaging and thinking out loud, making arguments on how the world is, how it could be, how it should be. That's a perilous endeavor, both generally in our fractured time, but also specifically in that many people currently listening are friends and family members, people I know and love personally. It is a fertile but fraught terrain. In the third section of episode 2, around minute 18, I really leaned into my rage, reaching feats of fiery prose and catharsis. In that moment it felt good. With some of you it resonated, echoed frustrations and sentiments you agree with. If you agree with a cathartic statement, it feels encouraging, invigorating, validating. With others of you, my angry self-righteousness, emotional insensitivity, and degree of philosophical dishonesty in unfairly collapsing complexities and the discrepancies of our worldviews for the sake of brevity came at the cost of any degree of persuasion and caused some pain in people I love. I regret leaning so heavily into my anger in episode 2. Not because I disagree with the argument I was making, but because it decreased the efficacy of my goal of persuasion, of building a big tent. I further regret in episode 3 reflecting only on the merits of the argument I was trying to make, and not my tone, not the words I chose to use, the personal intensity of the attacks. I was overly self-assured, dismissive, unreflective. In speaking in such a broad and absolute way, I collapsed the complexity of my worldview and the complexity of the worldview of others. And it is in that complexity and nuance of opinions that we actually have a lot in common. It is obvious in retrospect, but when talking about the language of fire, one must be careful to examine what and how one is burning. I take seriously my role here as a public thinker. You may or may not agree with everything or anything that I say, or the things that I focus on, but I cherish that you are listening and are willing to give me the opportunity to present what I believe, and engage with what you believe and value. I hope and believe that we all want to make the world a better place, and this is the space where I articulate some of the ways I think that is possible. When I leaned into my sincere but overly raw rage, I think it is understandable as a human, as a fellow ape doing his best, but it is also unconvincing to those who disagree with me. As a person aiming to persuade, aiming to bring disparate people together, that was a failure of persuasion. I brought along the people who agree with me wholesale, but I lost the people with whom I have common ground but differ in the details, the nuance that makes us human. The question then is, how does one move forward as an amateur public intellectual when you say something in a way that you wish you could say differently? My initial impulse was to go and rework the episodes, to recalibrate my prose, add nuance, kindness, love. I think it is likely that most people who will find this podcast have not already found this podcast. So it has a clear logic to streamlining the on-ramp into our salamander family to make it as inviting as possible. But I've decided not to. It's not that I'm lazy. I could go back and trim things down, re-record a bit, but it feels slightly dishonest to me, or at least not as regenerative as it could be. I've said what I've said. I'm not using any pseudonyms here. I am speaking out in the open, and I'm on a journey with myself, with you, and with this nascent community. Instead, I want to lean into the mindset of compost. To grow this garden, we need organic matter, content, ideas, thoughts, passion, rage, and contrition, to ferment and decompose with the steady passage of time, to give rise to new culture, to show the evolution of thought. Over time, like the application of compost in a garden, I think an ethic of iterative insight will bear fruit. So let's tease apart the argument, add some air, let the argument breathe, then add some nuance to cool the temperature. This will not come as a surprise to any listeners, but I was gut punched by the election. I'm a liberal, sure, I embrace the mantle. I believe in individual rights, civil liberties, democracy, free enterprise. More specifically, I am a humanist, an egalitarian, a pluralist, a quasi-secular academic with progressive values, an absurdist and surrealist, a long-termist, a self-proclaimed social minarchist. I have an appreciation for honest, meritocratic, technocratic leadership, and a belief that we should be skeptical and clear-eyed about the government and institutions, but that good people in government can harness our collective civic energy and taxes to do good in the world, to make our lives safer, easier, more fulfilling. I believe that certain services are best done collectively. I like libraries. I like public schools. I think it's problematic the DoD can't pass an audit on their almost $1 trillion budget, but I do understand that freedom isn't free, and I'm glad we have a strong military and people voluntarily serving in it. I'm glad we have firefighters, police people, engaged bureaucrats. I'm also more global-minded than many people. I'm glad we have representatives at the UN. I think we should sign onto the International Court of Justice. I think that we should pursue multilateral solutions to global problems. I think our international partners make us stronger, though I do think we should hold our allies to higher standards, and we should not partner with autocracies for political realist convenience. The list goes on, but overall, I'm a progressive. I think that we have historically and can continue to bend the arc of history towards justice. I think that healthy politics and political systems are a necessary part of that. In our limited first-past-the-post political system, my philosophical underpinnings lead me to caucus with the Democrats, But the Big D Democratic Party is not my ideal political coalition. To be fair to my listeners who end up caucusing with the Republicans, I know the same is true for many of you in the inverse. If I could wave my shovel in the air and change one thing about our governance, I would change to a ranked choice voting system so that we could support more nuanced parties and not the two-party behemoths we have in our country. The way we currently count votes in a winner-take-all election mathematically guarantees having a two-party system. If I had a second wish, I would also overturn the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United and stop unlimited political donations from corporations into our political system. But in any open and fair democratic republic system, even a ranked choice voting system and campaign finance reform, you will have people express their preferences in their vote, and the outcome with the most support, according to the way the votes are tallied, will prevail. That necessarily means that some people will not have their preferred candidates in power, and that the policy agenda of the losing coalition will be disfavored, and that the ruling coalition will enact their policy. Then the country will see the outcomes of those policies and will reward or punish the governing coalition in the next election. That's Civics 101, the cost of living in democracy. And I understand that. I agree with it in principle. I understand that Kamala Harris lost and that Donald J. Trump is being sworn in today as I record this podcast. But bearing all of that in mind, I was still gut punched by the specifics of this election. After everything we've been through, after everything we know about the man, I sincerely did not think my fellow decent Americans would choose Donald J. Trump to once again sit in the highest seat of power in our nation. I sincerely thought that the decent people would see past his obvious lies, would see his rampant immorality and petty self-interested criminality. I hoped that society would see the real danger he poses and would not endorse him with their vote. I really hoped that my daughter would grow up in a better world for her, and that all of the children in my life and in our country would not be raised in this burgeoning environment of corruption, cronyism, short-termism, ineptitude, and hate. I was wrong in my estimation of society, and violently disabused of my optimism on election day. So here we are, at the beginning of a seismic regime change for our nation and the world. There are a lot of policy items proposed by Trump and the current Republican coalition that I think are on balance a bad idea, but that I'm not viscerally offended by. For example, I actually am sympathetic to the importance of onshoring key industrial capacity in the United States with incentives and tariffs. The Biden administration didn't really talk about this, but they actually did maintain and strengthen various tariffs on China originally imposed by the first Trump administration. However, I do think imposing large and untargeted tariffs on our geopolitical rivals, moreover on our geopolitical allies like Canada and Mexico, is a bad idea. I think this because no matter how many times Trump and his allies lie that tariffs are a cost paid by the exporting country, that is just false. Tariffs are taxes imposed by our government that importers pay and pass on the price to consumers. I fear that these tariffs will give even more opportunity for corruption, for leaders of mega corporations to cut backroom deals with the Trump administration in exchange for special privileges and exemptions. There is evidence this happened in the first Trump administration. I am certain it will happen in this administration. And at the end of the day, even ignoring the potential for abuse, this will just increase the price of goods for Americans. It's a form of regressive sales tax. This will hurt the poor, even the middle class, by decreasing their purchasing power and by extension, decreasing their quality of life. I fear the Americans who largely, and in my opinion misguidedly, voted for Trump due to the cost of living challenges will see these problems get worse as a direct result of these policies. But I'm not viscerally offended by tariffs. They seem like a relatively normal axis of political disagreement. I think there is plenty of gray area and an argument to be had on to what extent we should be inwardly focused and protectionist, or American first, as they say, versus to what extent we should embrace globalization and interfacing in the world economy to harness the efficiencies of trade, or to what extent we should embrace American leadership in the world with our coalition of democratic allies. I think similar normal political discourse exists on tax rates, personal income tax, corporate tax rates. I think there's normal disagreement for how much we should spend on entitlements and how much we should actually care about the deficit. I think there are normal tensions between notions of heritage and patriotic national pride versus coming to honest terms with our complicated national history and efforts to progress to an ever more just and equitable future. But there are dimensions to Trump personally, and more importantly his policy agenda, that I find personally repugnant, that I find to be hateful and bigoted, not only tangibly harmful to Americans in terms of everyday well-being, but evil, corrosive to our national soul. There are dimensions to Trump and his agenda that I find transparently inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus. This is despite the fact that according to exit polls, the people that actually got off of the couch and voted, 63% of all Christians, 72% of white Protestant Christians, and 82% of white born-again evangelical Christians supported him. And this is where my perhaps self-righteousness, but sincere rage came from. As I said previously, I find the disconnect galling. I truly am so tired of it. Do I really need to put together a supercut of all the heinous things Trump has said over the years? Of him bragging about grabbing the pussies of less powerful women because he is rich and famous? Of him mocking the weak and the physically disabled? Of him slandering the vulnerable, accusing migrants and racial minorities of made-up crimes and wrongdoing? And that's to not even bring up the weird stuff, or just incredibly stupid stuff like nuking hurricanes. The sad reality is that enough people either just rejected the evidence in front of their lying eyes, or acknowledged that Trump is a bad person, but simply don't care, that somehow he is a bad person doing work for them or for God, even though I personally have only ever seen him act for himself, and for himself alone. I see this canyon-wide chasm of cognitive dissonance all around me. Now, to be fair, I did gloss over a piece of complexity here in episode 2 that was fairly brought up in rebuttal from a friend and listener of the podcast. Many people are sincerely anti-abortion, or as they would label themselves, pro-life. There are a few flavors of these arguments, but in general, these people believe that human life and the full moral value therein begins at fusion of sperm and egg, aka fertilization, aka conception. They contend that most, if not all, abortions are murder. Worse, murder of the innocent, the ultimate evil. Ironically, the abortion rate actually increased 8% in Trump's first term from 2016 to 2020. This was the first increase in 30 years, probably due to a variety of causes, but at least in part because Trump and Vice President Pence cut the Title X family planning services and access to contraception. Less contraception, more unwanted pregnancies, more abortions. But it is true that Trump appointed several justices, perjurers to a one in their Senate testimonies, I will say, but justices that upended decades of legal precedent that established the framework where people are allowed to get legal abortions nationally, kicking the right to access this service to the states, allowing the states to restrict or completely block the procedure. Some people see this as a good thing. If the courts go further, as they are now likely to, given that they have recently given themselves unprecedented power over the entire administrative state by overturning the Chevron doctrine, and they assert their superior pharmacological knowledge over the FDA and rescind authorization of abortion pills, specifically the drugs mifepristone and misoprostol, we may well see a dramatic drop in legal abortions. For the anti-abortion advocates, this is an unalloyed good. No more baby murder. Simple, clean, uncomplicated. How can you be for killing babies? I acknowledge here, and should have acknowledged in episode 2, that clearly being against abortion is such a deep underpinning of many people's moral and political beliefs that they might think themselves internally consistent as followers of Jesus for voting for Trump using this logic. I will have you know that I am not a deranged baby killer. But I will make the case in the next episode that the mainstream pro-life stance is an incredibly incomplete way of addressing the complexities of reproductive health care. And I will further argue that these policies are actively anti-life when viewed from a more inclusive lens. But that is a big topic, and I need more space to let it breathe on its own. So let's put a bookmark there for now. Taking a step back, I do understand that not all of the folks who empowered Trump and his coalition back into power in this election cycle and in the previous election cycles are themselves hateful to the weak and marginal, to the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and otherwise beautiful non-conforming individuals in our society. People who in their personal lives do not seek to marginalize people different than themselves. People are weird. There are even some individuals from these groups that, for whatever reason, also voted to empower this coalition. But if you care about these individuals, I sincerely fear time will show this to have been a grave mistake. If you follow Supreme Court opinions, specifically in Clarence Thomas's concurrence overturning the Casey versus Planned Parenthood precedent, he specifically targeted the doctrine of substantive due process, in which courts are able to use the Constitution to identify and protect implied rights, like the right to privacy. These are not specifically enumerated in the Constitution. It may be surprising to hear, but the Founding Fathers didn't write a lot about specific rights in the Constitution, like the right to masturbate, the right to sodomize and to be sodomized, the right to use dildos, fleshlights, and remote-controlled anal beads, the right to use birth control, or engage in any of the freaky forms of consensual adult intimacy. But I argue, and the courts have consistently argued for the past 60 years, that as red-blooded Americans, we have the right to privacy from the government in these areas and in other areas not explicitly spelled out in our founding parchments. All of the conservative justices currently in power of the highest court of our land are skeptical of these implied rights, or at least are willing to ignore the whole framework when it comes to abortion. Clarence Thomas explicitly does not think that you or I have these implied rights in the Constitution. He specifically calls out 3 of the 4 foundational civil rights cases in this area. Griswold versus Connecticut, that relies on substantive due process to give married couples the right to use contraception. He specifically called out Lawrence versus Texas, that establishes the rights of same-sex consenting adults to engage in intimacy. He specifically called out a Bergefeld versus Hodges, that establishes the right for same-sex couples to be married. It's worth noting that Clarence Thomas, who is in an interracial marriage to noted insurrectionist Ginny Thomas, didn't call out Loving versus Virginia, a case that also relies on the logic of substantive due process and gives individuals the right to have interracial marriages. I find this intellectually dishonest and an egregious display of hypocrisy and lack of judicial rigor typical of Clarence Thomas. If that strikes you as underhanded, fair enough, but it's also accurate. Please do a quick search on billionaire Harlan Crow and his corrupt courting of Justices Thomas and Alito, and then tell me the court does not need a complete overhaul of judicial ethics and some impeachments to boot. The coalition that Trump is a part of, that he has heralded back into power, is in a decades-long fight to erode these liberties the American people have won. This is not hyperbole. This is a stated goal from the highest court of our land. Many of these judges are old, and now Trump will elevate new, wildly unqualified, young zealots like Eileen Cannon that will lock in these existing travesties of justice and will lock in further erosions of the rule of law and civil liberties for decades to come. If you voted for Trump, irrespective of what you may believe in your personal life, you have helped empower people that seek to marginalize the vulnerable, your fellow citizens, your neighbors, your friends, your family, my neighbors, my friends, my family. Even people I don't know, but whose pain I feel because I have a deep well of empathy that extends far beyond myself and my family. I don't need to be a transgender woman to know that that experience must be filled with loneliness, uncertainty, fear, and real danger made worse by being the target of demagoguery. I have often joked that I'm disappointingly straight, that if I were a bit more flexible in my preferences, it could have opened some doors for me back in the day. But in all seriousness, I don't need to be attracted to men to know that some men are, that love and building a life with someone is beautiful and complicated, that desire is individual and idiosyncratic. I don't want anyone telling me who I should love, how I should love them, how I should present myself to the world, when and if I use contraception or sex toys, and I don't want the government telling anyone else either. And you, by voting to empower those who want to impose their will on people with preferences different than their own, have voted to commit legalized violence against people I love. That's why I'm mad. That's why it's not a trivial, polite difference of political opinion to me. Jesus was a friend of the lepers, and the tax collectors, and the prostitutes. Do you think he would be so judgmental of drag queens? It's not just the beautiful LGBTQIA+ members of our salamander family that I fear for, and that I am furious on behalf of. It's also our immigrant community, documented and undocumented. Laying more of my cards on the table, I am a much more pro-immigrant person than most people, than even most Democrats these days. I think the Statue of Liberty, always an aspirational symbol more than reality, basically gets it right. Give me your tired, give me your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. As terrible as we have been to Native people, to Black people, to every new immigrant community that comes to America, America is now the world's best multi-ethnic democracy. The America we know and love has been made stronger by immigrants coming from around the world seeking a better life for themselves and their families, influencing and assimilating into our culture over time. Just like gardening and regenerative agriculture, my opinions in this area come from a full lifetime of experience. This was actually one of the writing challenges in my first set of reflections, which details to include, which were extraneous. When I learned about natural systems and about people, it wasn't as two separate silos, but an intertwined tornado of experience that is life. Now, clearly, not all immigrants speak Spanish, but a lot of immigrants in the United States do, and Spanish has been central to my experiences with different immigrant communities. I was lucky and had at least basic Spanish classes as early as kindergarten. I remember in first grade the Spanish teacher going through the colors, verde, green, rojo, red, azul, blue, and amarillo, which is yellow, with a scrunched up face like she was disgusted. Kids really have no context for anything, so this doesn't strike me as particularly strange, but thinking back, I do wonder why she hated yellow so much. But I learned some Spanish in elementary school, and then actually started to learn it in 9th grade, when I started to learn about verbos, verbs, conjugation, and so much vocabulario. My older brother Grant, none other than Señor Gustavo Marron, had also learned Spanish, and was someone I could actually try to have conversations with, secret conversations. Secret conversations that we could have in front of our parents without them knowing what we were saying. How cool is that? In that same year, I started working at Panera Bread, the Panera Bread on Westtown Parkway, in a lone, medium-sized office tower building, maybe 3 stories of dental clinics and nondescript office cubicles, and a Panera Bread store. My friend Nick worked there at the time, so when I turned 16, I walked in for a job and immediately got sat down at one of the small tables near a window and had an interview with the store's general manager. I don't want to brag, but I pretty much nailed the interview. They gave me a sheet of questions and I returned a sheet of correct answers. All except one answer. They asked what I thought being late meant, and I said 5 minutes. That was wrong. The correct answer was 0 minutes. Better yet, 5 minutes beforehand. But I got the job and would go on over the next years to master the art of dishes and the dining room and the line station and the bakery station and the registers. I was versatile. I mostly closed the store, but I could open it. I grew in my Panera knowledge until I gained the coveted promotion to associate trainer and the associated 30-cent raise. But the real prize was earning the right to share my vast Panera knowledge with the new associates joining our Panera. Lots of stories, but not today. Today I'm talking about immigrants. At Panera, I worked for the first time in my life with immigrant people. The first was a Mexican fellow named Alex, a short man with an easy, gap-toothed smile. He spoke basically zero English, but was great to work with. He always had a positive attitude and was hardworking, bustling to and from the dish room to grab bus bins out of the dining room and come back and really keep the back of the house in pristine condition. We got along great, and I frequently talked to my managers to let me go on break at the same time as Alex, so that we could eat together, trying to piece together a conversation with my very limited Spanish and his even more limited English, but with a lot of smiles. It was the first time where learning to speak Spanish enabled me to communicate with someone that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. The second was a short Ecuadorian girl, a year or two younger than me, named Mariela. Mariela was a fun, spunky person. I once called her Señora, and she made sure to correct me. No, Señorita, Señora is old. She went to the alternative high school, and so it was interesting to compare her classes relative to mine. It was strange to say, but Mariela was the first kid I ever met that didn't plan on going to college. I had literally never conceptualized that as a life path before. The third person was a Mexican woman named Valentina. Valentina was a motherly figure. I think she was literally a mom to several children, but also just her energy and aura. She spoke English well and was a kind but no-nonsense person. We generally worked on the line together, the area of the store where the sandwiches and salads and soups come out of. I don't remember all of the conversations I had with Valentina over the years, but I do remember one conversation we had about undocumented people. And she said a line that has stuck with me all of these years. Nadie es ilegal. Nadie es ilegal. It means no one is illegal. Everyone is human, first and foremost. When I graduated high school, I kept up with my Spanish. I read Harry Potter y la Piedra Filosofal, the Sorcerer's Stone, and entered college studying Spanish on the side, just for kicks. Before I took any official classes in university, I went a couple weeks early for an honors program orientation where we got mostly familiar with campus and started making friends, but also each took a 1 credit hour course in a subject matter that was interesting to us. Coming from my debate background and being an international studies major at the time, I chose to do public policy analysis. The specific public policy I chose to study was immigration policy, specifically the effect of the border wall on immigration patterns. Keep in mind, we've had basic cattle fencing being erected since 1900. The US government started building more fencing in the 1940s. Jimmy Carter's administration replaced some sections and extended the wall. There was a big expansion in the border fence under George H.W. Bush's administration that was completed and extended under Bill Clinton's presidency. This was built further by George W. Bush, and the whole fence construction was monitored and maintained, but not expanded under Obama. To put this in perspective, by the time Trump came on the stage and began promising Americans that he would build a grand wall that Mexico would pay for, we already had 654 miles of primary fencing, 37 miles of secondary fencing, and 14 miles of tertiary fencing. That's a lot of wall already built, enough to really mess up tortoise and jaguar migration, to imperil the Rio Grande ecosystem writ large, and enough to push migrants to use unsafe corridors through the desert, where they die in the heat of the sun and exposure of the elements. From even my cursory foray into the world of public policy analysis as a college freshman, actually looking at the numbers, the inadequacy of our conversation around immigration became obvious. It turns out that every increased effort to control the border through fencing actually had the paradoxical effect of increasing the number of long-term undocumented people in the United States. How, you might ask? Because the walls don't change the incentives of people wanting to come to the United States, both for economic mobility and prosperity, or for personal safety and safety of their families. But we have always had seasonal movement of migrants in this country. But by forcing people into danger in the deserts and having them overcome increasingly difficult obstacles, it made it a lot harder for them to return to Mexico or their home countries, forcing them to stay. Once university started in fall, I began taking classes. Over the semesters I took Spanish linguistics, Iberian Peninsula literature, the literature of the conquest of the Americas, Spanish creative writing, and more. Eventually, the Spanish major led me to study abroad in Valparaiso, Chile, for a summer, where I stayed with a kind and engaged host family. I walked through the cerros and the plano to meet the people and took classes. I learned about the socio-economic history of Chile. It's a fascinating country, and it was fascinating to learn the history of another country from their perspective and experience it. When I got back, I helped my pre-law friend Nick Hallman by translating the UIHC Human Rights Coalition's Immigration Know Your Rights Manual into Spanish. The manual explained the legal rights, which avenues, if any, existed for legal defenses for people. When I got back, I helped my pre-law friend Nick Hallman by translating the UIHC Human Rights Coalition Know Your Rights Manual into Spanish. The manual explained the legal rights, which avenues, if any, existed for legal defense by those detained by immigration authorities. When we were finished, I went with him to the Hardin County ICE detention facility and gave a little presentation in Spanish to the folks being detained there. I don't know how the detained people there fared after I left. I don't know if they went on to claim asylum, if they were fleeing violence or persecution, or even if they had enough specific evidence to prove their cases. Perhaps they were only trying to improve their lives and their families' lives, and they were ultimately forcibly deported. For what it's worth, they didn't look dangerous to me. I can't say how they felt, but I can say it didn't feel good seeing them there. A summer later, I stayed with some extended family members and volunteered as a translator in a migrant health clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. I helped translate between the patients and the clinicians and had a lot of time to sit with people. I saw a lot of people that had obvious and curable problems, a hernia, a varicocele, but they didn't have insurance and they weren't able to get the full health care they needed. There was a young, undocumented father that I will always remember that came in and explained to me that he worked in the canning factory during the day and at a dairy farm during the evening helping milk cows. He had a wife and a kid that he also tried to see. He asked the doctor for antidepressants and did get them, but I think he was also just tired, just worn out from the work. I've met a lot of people in other places, from other places. And that's all before mentioning all of the great international students, researchers, mentors, colleagues I have had, and friends and colleagues from around the world that I have in my life now. That's all before mentioning the stories from friends and family navigating and sometimes losing the visa and green card systems. All of that is to say that I am sympathetic to immigrants. I feel my own ancestral immigrant heritage. I can imagine a life where I have to flee my home for safety or a better life for my family, where that's the best option. I'm so grateful that hasn't been my life. Immigration is a complicated issue. Solutions should be thoughtful, thorough, I contend kind, just, inclusive. Solutions that uphold the rule of law while seeking avenues to integrate those already in our communities to become full contributing members of society. But that's not what we're about to see. We are about to see, above all else, performative cruelty on a massive scale. We are going to see communities brutalized by our government. This is the path chosen by a narrow majority of voters, a narrow plurality of all the people in our country. It should be noted, we already prosecute, jail, and eventually deport actually violent criminals. There are some heinous cases that happen. They're rare, demonstrably much more rarely perpetrated by immigrants than people in the general population, but tragic cases nonetheless do happen. And these cases are highly amplified in the media and our collective consciousness. Bad people of all types do exist, and criminals are prosecuted in our system. In reality, the bar is already very low for what people get deported for. Small traffic violations can be enough. Anything that puts you on the radar of our arbitrary and capricious immigration bureaucracy can be enough. And now it will be worse, more cruel, less judicious. What we are going to see now are regular people, working people, contributing to society, ripped from their lives and their families. Some people who have probably mostly known the United States. Normal people, family people, people with families. Often people in families with American citizens. Estimates vary. There are roughly between 11 to 15 million undocumented people living in the United States right now. Trump's coalition includes true believers in people that reject the humanity of these immigrants, that actively seek out cruelty as a strategy, and are set to enact a reign of terror on communities and on our nation. Stephen Miller is a zealot on this issue. Tom Homan is a zealot on this issue. They have been empowered to enact these policies. Will they be able to deport all illegal immigrants? Probably not. We do now have a vast network of surveying and tracking in our country. I can imagine the government exerting greater levels of control over these systems and our lives in authoritarian surveillance state where they truly could go door to door, street to street, and raid the country. It would cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and in my estimation, be terrible for humanity, but it is a path we can and might take. But more likely, no. It will be less than promised. It will cost more than suggested. Will ICE manage to round up 100,000 additional people? 1,000,000 people? More? I don't know. But I know it was a core promise of the Trump campaign. A core group of people that were systematically demonized, scapegoated, made alien. I know these groups of people make easy targets, sacrificial lambs to quench the call for blood simmering in society right now. Some voters, supporters of Donald Trump, are out for blood. They want people to suffer. Some people who voted for Donald Trump like to shield themselves from this reality, in their own mind, if nothing else, to shield themselves from the moral weight of their own choices by suggesting that maybe things won't be as bad as what they have been told it will be, what they have been promised. Maybe the leader is just lying, exaggerating for political opportunism and expediency. Donald Trump does lie a lot, makes a lot of false promises. Will he invade Greenland or Panama, as he's been ranting about recently? Who knows? I hope not. However, from my vantage point, when a political party and politician makes a foundational promise to their constituents repeatedly, and someone votes for that candidate, they own the moral weight of that choice. I think that all of the people who voted for Donald Trump are morally responsible for the outcomes that come from empowering Donald Trump and the Republican coalition. Which is why, when I draw upon my understanding and my relationship with Jesus, I feel so bewildered. Are the other Christians reading the same Matthew chapter 25, verses 35 to 40? For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. And the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did I see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you as a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? And the king will reply, Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. I think there is such a wide gap between what Jesus calls people to do and what Trump and the current Republican establishment are doing and want to do. Representatives who themselves are people who predominantly call themselves followers of Jesus and quote Genesis and other biblical passages in their official capacity as government officials. Because as a nation, and on a state level here in Iowa, we have empowered this slate of representatives. People fleeing violence will have a harder time getting asylum in our country. The hungry are being and will be denied food. Water will be made increasingly undrinkable. More healing medicines and services will be withheld from those who need them. Strangers living here peacefully will be brutalized and torn from their families. Keep in mind, I don't believe in hell, at least not in the same sense that many people do. I think that it is earth that we can make either more an Eden or more like hell for ourselves and others. I think that our society and the vast majority of purportedly family-loving Christians therein just voted to make Earth more hell-like for millions. Just voted to make the world less like the world Jesus instructs his followers to bring about. But for those who claim to follow Jesus and do fear judgment in the afterlife, what is the right level of penance for a person who has strayed so far from the values they espouse and internalize? I've already given my answer. Today, I'll leave that question here for you to feel yourself, and I do hope you sit with the weight of it. Today, we all are, those who chose this path and those that did not, entering a new political and cultural regime of historic consequence. I fear for us. I grieve for us the imperfect but comparatively brighter future that could have been. And today, I continue fighting for us. For as long as I live, I will fight for us in my words and, more importantly, my actions. I stand now and forever with all of the kind people in society. I stand with those who seek to give food to the hungry, water to the thirsty, hospitality to the strangers, and material support to those who need it, as I was personally taught to by Jesus. This brings me to the second sponsor of today's episode, Tapestry Farms here in Davenport. Tapestry Farms. Tapestry Farms is an organization in Davenport. I've been a big fan of this organization since I discovered them last year. They do important work welcoming people fleeing violence from around the world into the Davenport community. They provide a whole host of supporting services, including a vocational training CSA program using underutilized urban land. This is a great community building organization, and in honor of today's episode, I went ahead and renewed my charitable contribution to them like I did last year, and I'm hoping to actively get more involved, actually volunteering with them in the coming year. The website is tapestryfarms.org to find out more, and I hope you will consider checking them out, and if you have anything to spare, to donate to them. Part 3. Norms and Conventional Wisdom. In this final section, I want to talk about speaking out, discourse, and disagreement. There are people everywhere, for all of human history, who tell change makers to stop, that it is wrong to speak up, that it is wrong to try to change the status quo. These people don't necessarily question the argument being made, how true or false a premise being offered is, but rather, they often question the speaker. How dare you speak up now? How dare you speak up in that way? How dare you speak up about that? How dare you speak up? How dare anyone speak up and rock our fragile boat already navigating turbulent waters? But what is a good sailor to do when they see the boat navigating towards a maelstrom? When they see some of the crew members and the captain hoarding all of the rations while others are suffering from scurvy? What should a good sailor do when they see their marginalized fellow crew members being walked off the plank? When they see their helmsperson being led astray by the siren's call of mermaid propaganda, steering to crash the boat due to the alluring but false promise of fish lady love? I think there is a grain of wisdom in seeking harmony and avoiding conflict above all else. Surely not every situation is the right time for debate. Some time is meant for peace and comfort, to be spent with family. Time spent deepening love and connection through physical closeness and telling stories, playing with babies, doing puzzles and baking cookies. Even doing chores together, working towards common goals. Where I think the argument goes too far is where the desire for peace and to preserve the status quo becomes an implicit prohibition of questioning norms, questioning values, questioning ourselves, questioning others, at least not publicly, at least not forcefully. I think the argument goes too far in terms of questioning the wisdom of our elders, however wise they may be. Claiming to be non-political is not in itself some enlightened stance. It just means you're fine with the status quo, with the path we are on. That in itself is a political stance. Sometimes it is necessary to rock the boat, to call out what we see as wrong in society, to question the wisdom of anyone with power, including our elders. There's an example of this from the world of regenerative agriculture that I think about a lot. In northern Burkina Faso, Africa, near a town called Yatenga, was a man named Yakuba Sawadogo. Yakuba was born in this region of the Sahel the fragile semi-arid region of Africa between the Sahara to the north and the grasslands to the south. In the 1980s, this region experienced a horrendous prolonged drought, where the lands received only 20% of their normal rainfall. This was devastating to crops and farming communities. The villages began to empty out. People were driven to the cities to find work and food. But Yacuba looked at the ancient practice of zai farming, digging circular pits in the ground to catch rains and give the amaranth crop moisture to grow during the dry season. While he was drawing on ancient wisdom, he tried to innovate. Instead of digging the zai pits during the rainy season when the ground was softer, he went out by himself and dug the pits during the dry season. This was perceived as madness by the elders and his community. Maybe for good reason. Maybe in years of plenty of moisture, it was dangerous for people to go out and work in the hotter, drier periods of the year. But Yacuba perceived that every drop of water was precious and needed to be captured. By digging during the dry period, he was able to capture every millimeter of rain when the rains came. If that wasn't already crazy enough, he also made the holes wider than was tradition and added animal manure and woody debris to bring up the fertility in the hole and to encourage the endemic termites to colonize the holes, digging in the ground, providing airflow and water infiltration. None of this seems that crazy from my perspective, but to Yacuba's fellow villagers, this was nothing less than scandalous, sacrilegious, highly disrespectful to the chieftains and the elders of the community at the time. So much so that as his system started to grow and produce amaranth when his neighbors' fields continued to desertify, the villagers didn't immediately recognize the wisdom of his works. Rather, they came and burned down his house and his fields. Fortunately, he didn't give up, and he continued to go against the conventional wisdom of the time. And eventually people saw his yields. The proof is in the pudding, as we say. They saw him feeding his family and community, and eventually they came around to his techniques. He passed away after a long life in 2023, but before he passed, his work became some of the foundational work that has been applied across the Sahel region, helping to build a living agroecological wall that is sustaining livelihoods and nurturing communities across this fragile region. His life and work were brought into mainstream Western prominence in 2010 in a documentary called The Man Who Held Back the Desert. It's worth watching. That Yacuba was able to challenge the conventional wisdom and persevere even in the face of adversity from his friends and family started a movement that is transforming a region. His impact will live on through the ages, improving the lives of humans and the natural world alike. I contend we are in such a situation in our present moment. We are in the 6th mass extinction. The amount of life and diversity of life on Earth is in freefall. The very planetary systems that sustain us are being changed and broken. Each of the past 10 years have been the hottest in the hundreds of years we have measured. The temperature also continues to rise at an accelerating pace, accompanied by more powerful natural disasters. As we destabilize our climate around the world, we are also turning an increasingly blind eye away from the suffering of our fellow humans. We are living in a time of cruelty, bitter, senseless cruelty. And I think it is our duty to speak out against the evils as we see them in the world, to bring people together in the fight towards a more just and abundant future. No person is perfect, no institution beyond reproach. I think it is wise to be guided by love, but that it is folly to not speak out for your morals in an effort to avoid offending loved ones. I think we can make change. I think we can make the future better for ourselves, our families, our communities, and our world. I am here fighting for you. I am here fighting with you, in solidarity with you. My pantry is stocked. My garden is sleeping, but the systems are made, my seeds are ready. My friends and family know that I'm here for them, that my mind is awake, and that my heart is filled with love, but has been hardened with resolve to withstand the days ahead. It is not inevitable that we will be taken by the darkness of the days and years to come. We must continue to fight for the ecosystems that will be targeted for exploitation, for our neighbors being stripped of their rights, for the salamanders, literal and figurative. They need us. We owe it to them, and we owe it to ourselves not to give in now. we can make a kinder, more abundant future. May grace and strength be granted upon us all. That's my episode for today. Thanks for listening. And as always, if you have any thoughts, questions, feedback, good and bad, please send it my way. On YouTube, you can comment, or to the email address, theregionbeacon@gmail.com, or however else you're used to getting a hold of me. I always love hearing from you. Until next time, I hope you find time to unplug and spend time in nature. And as they say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.